think one of the biggest disservices that has been done to Africa and to the African information ecosystem is,
They knew what was going on?
but I'd heard whispers that there were things that were less than acceptable going on behind the scenes at Flutterwave. Nigerians are not cybercrime kingpins or anything close to it. Anything close to it.
Is this a title that they enjoy?
I've had to learn how to walk into a room and not be noticed. How to sort of
Live like a ghost?
exactly.
David, who is Bola Ahmed Tinubu?
That is the question. That is the question.
Where is Peter Obi? How does the future look like? Do you think he's gonna be sworn?
That's a very difficult question, to be honest.
Do you feel safe?
No, I was informed reliably that a Zoom meeting was held from the camp of that presidential candidate where I was discussed, basically, and what was discussed was essentially how to eliminate me.
Welcome to the REN experience, where we celebrate those making a difference in our times and inspire you to achieve the same. In keeping up with that, we have been analyzing our data and realized that 96% of our audience haven't yet subscribed to the channel. We want to bring that number down to 90%. So if you enjoy our content, kindly do me a favor by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription helps us grow and gives us the power to bring you the guests that you want to see on the show. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, because it seems like you are really putting in a lot of effort and trying to research and really find out behind the scenes and what is going on and really put pieces together, something that is really missing nowadays, especially with journalists.
Well, I mean, I try. I certainly like to think of myself as someone who puts depth into his work. That's the brand that I've built, and hopefully it continues to be what I'm known for. So thanks for noticing.
I know, yeah, you dig a lot. You dig a lot. Do you feel safe?
No. So when you choose to take on these kinds of stories, and particularly when you take them on using a particular kind of tone that I think maybe on the African continent, most audiences are really not used to, it creates a certain perception that on its own can endanger one's safety. So when I set out in 2019 to start building this thing that I'm still building now, 4 years later, I knew that there were going to be certain risks involved. Perhaps I maybe underestimated how quickly these threats will turn into real, like, existential mortal threats, because it took a little just over a year. So I started off in August 2019, and by November 2020, I'd had to flee the country. I'd had to flee Nigeria. So literally just over a year of like high impact, full contact investigative journalism, and I had to leave the country. And since then, thankfully, there are a few friendly jurisdictions around the world where I've been able to sort of lay my head. A couple of, I've been granted asylum in at least one notable jurisdiction. So I have a bit of relief here and there, but even then, one is never safe, and I can't stay in one place for too long. So if you see me sort of putting my head out and announcing the fact that I'm in a particular location, you should know that I'm either not there or I don't plan to be there very long. It just comes with the turf. So no, I'm not safe. I'm never safe. And I constantly sort of have an eye, on the back of my head looking over my shoulder. That's just unfortunately the way it is. But again, I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm not asking for anyone to feel sorry for me, because I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew what the risks were involved. I knew what this life was going to look like when I went into it. And I thought that what I was trying to achieve was more important than what potentially it could be exposing me to. And so far, that hasn't changed. So let's hope it doesn't change.
Well, let's hope it doesn't change. What are some of the threats that you have been receiving?
Okay. So I guess the one you'll probably be most interested in hearing is like the death threats. I've received loads of those, starting from the ones you don't take serious because there's just like people on Twitter sending you DMs or tweeting at you, wishing you dead, telling you that you're going to, giving you date and time and location where you're going to die. Obviously, you don't take those things serious because you know they're BS, but there have also been more serious ones as a result of, so starting from 2019, in fact. Most recently in 2022, when I did a story which you might have seen on my platform called Bola Ahmed Tinubu from drug lord to presidential candidate. And I later released a documentary on my YouTube channel, which was based on that story. And I was informed quite reliably. Obviously, I can't, give any details that might identify my source, but I was informed reliably that a Zoom meeting was held from the camp of that presidential candidate, where I was discussed, basically. And what was discussed was essentially how to eliminate me, how to track me down, because nobody knew what country I was in. So how to track me down. They apparently went and hired some either American or Israeli security consultants who claimed they could track me down. And how this consultant claimed that they had traced me to South Africa, that I was in a hotel in Johannesburg. I've never been to South Africa before in my life, but they claimed that they traced me to South Africa. And so the idea was to stage an accident, or, and then there have been the other sort of non-lethal threats, but threats about, for example, like my livelihood. So, for example, if you continue making enemies like this, basically, if you continue being such a troublemaker, you're not going to be able to earn a living anywhere because nobody's going to want to be associated with you. And that even if you think that you are a mission-driven journalist, that every journalist needs friends, needs associates. You need, powerful people and organizations on your side. And if you continue doing some kinds of stories that people, even some people within these organizations don't like. So, for example, in September last year, I did a story that critiqued the BBC. And apparently it's a thing in journalism that apparently you are not supposed to cross the blue line. You're not supposed to criticize other journalists or other media establishments. So once you do that, then you become persona non grata. So I was warned, actually, that I was threatened, not warned. I was told that because I did that story, there were many opportunities that I could have had, that I could have in future, that I was going to lose. And to be honest, I've seen evidence of it, that some of these threats have been actualized. There have been prizes that I was shortlisted for, and then very sort of mysteriously my entry disappeared from the shortlist all of a sudden. Those kinds of things. So those things do happen. However, how I deal, or how I try to deal with these things is, first of all, I'm not going to pretend that it doesn't have any impact on me. It does. I'm not going to pretend like I'm some kind of Iron Man. I'm not. I'm a human being. It hurts, and it's, I do get scared as well. I do get frustrated. These things do have an effect. But how I try to deal with it is that I always try to remember that I set out from the get-go to be as independent as possible, and not just independent in terms of editorial independence, but also independent in terms of financial independence. So, for example, my main platform where my investigative work is domiciled is an independent platform. It's my own platform. It's a Substack newsletter. That's deliberate, right? A journalist of my profile could easily publish his work in a big national or continental or global media platform. I could. But the point is, once you do that, once you are ceding your independence to an external editor or to an external platform, and then they control your money by extension, that's just a hop and a skip away from what's the word I'm looking for? From censorship, from being controlled. So from the get-go, I've set out to be as independent as possible. I have a Substack newsletter. If you want to help pay for the work that I do, you can buy a subscription, or you can go to my Patreon. I have a YouTube channel where I create content out of the long form stories that I do. And obviously, the more you watch the videos, the more revenue that it makes for me via Google AdSense. So I've put a number of things in place to try and make myself as much of a self-contained ecosystem as possible, so that regardless of whatever threats are made or whatever threats are actualized, the work itself doesn't get to suffer.
When I hear you speak, I realize that there's so much BS going on around and we have no freaking idea. And individuals like yourselves are the ones who understand what the hell is going on. And it seems like, we need more people to be listening to you because you're really digging in deep and trying to find out what really exists behind the scene. Because nowadays, especially with social media, it's like really easy to push a propaganda and an agenda. And well, nowadays we are lazy to really like dig and find information and find what the hell is going on. So it's really important to have individuals like yourself, because you're also really risking your life for all this.
I mean, so I think that in one of the biggest disservices that has been done to Africa, because I think of what I do as not just a Nigerian thing, but more of like I think of it as an African thing. So even my platform is called West Africa Weekly, which is sort of like an aspirational name, even though most of the stories are Nigerian. But the plan is to expand into the West African sub-region and someday possibly into the wider African continent. Now, I think one of the biggest disservices that has been done to Africa and to the African information ecosystem is the lack of development of independent voices in this ecosystem. I think part of the reason that is widespread cheap internet access is still a relatively recent thing across most of the continent. So in Nigeria, for example, statistically, most Nigerians now are online. I think something like 88% of the country has access to the internet now. But statistically, most of that 88% came online between 2011 and now. So whereas much of the world outside has had internet access since the 1980s, right? There were people who went to university in the UK in 1989 who already had internet access in their dorm rooms. Statistically, in Nigeria, most people didn't get online until sometime within the past decade. So as a result, where the rest of the world has had a head start in creating sort of alternative information ecosystems outside of the established legacy media platforms, which are obviously controlled by people with economic and political power, we didn't have that advantage. So that's what people like me are trying to build now, belatedly, right? Because we have had that disadvantage of starting late. We are literally the last continent to get this thing off the ground on Earth. Every other continent on Earth had internet access at least since the early 2000s, and they've already been sort of creating these ecosystems. We're like 10, 12 years late, sometimes more. So what I'm trying to do now, regardless of the risk involved, and what people like me are trying to do now, regardless of the risk involved, is create these alternative information ecosystems, not just news, but information ecosystems. And why these are so important is that even in the political evolution of Africa as a civilization, that access to information, I think, has been one of the biggest breaks on African political growth, on African political development over the past half century, if not the past century. Because the people who control information, people who control the radio stations, if I'm not mistaken, radio is like by far the most accessible form of mass media in Africa till date. So those who control the radio stations, the TV stations, the newspapers, those are the people who traditionally have controlled what information gets into African heads. And the information that is getting into your head is the information that determines what economic and political decisions that you are making. So basically, the people in whose interests it is for Africa to have remained the way it is are the people who have been in control of the information for decades. So what this democratization of information is doing, and what it promises to do on a much wider scale as it becomes bigger, is to completely disrupt that model of certain people being in control of people's minds by making information, high quality information, so readily available and so easily accessible that basically a different political paradigm can be created. So it can be argued, for example, that the Nigerian elections, in as much as it's kind of like an ongoing car crash, as I think we're going to discuss further on in this episode. But in as much as we're witnessing like a car crash in real time, it's also the case that the reason we're even witnessing that car crash to begin with, the reason there are even that many young people who have registered to vote, and the reason there's this much interest and there's this much participation in the political process this time around, in the electoral process this time around, is precisely because the efforts of people who work in this alternative information space. That includes me, that includes people who do things on social media, websites like Twitter and Facebook, that includes other independent platforms, that includes just generally that new internet ecosystem. It has incubated a whole new political space that simply didn't exist before. So there have been 20 or 30 million new, the voter registrations in this political cycle. Voter registrations which simply wouldn't have happened otherwise. And the reason these things are happening now is because these new voters who are almost unanimously under the age of 25, almost entirely under the age of 30, feel like they've been energized by this information that they've got access to, information which they would definitely not have been able to get access to if it was still restricted to radio, TV, and newspapers, which are owned by the legacy players. So regardless of the risk involved, and people like me, what we are trying to do is accelerate this thing, make the current political system in Africa unsustainable, make the current system unfeasible by flooding the public space with high quality information that renders the sort of filtered, censored information from the legacy sources, basically renders it irrelevant, renders it moot. That's what we're trying to do.
And so, for example, if you want to research on a topic, like how do you even start doing that? How do you get into that?
Okay, so I'll use a story that I did as a case in point, because each story is different, and the research process for each story is different. So there is no. I always tell people whenever I'm asked a question about what my investigative process looks like is, people often think that as an investigator you have this sort of top hat with a cigar like Sherlock Holmes, and you have a magnifying glass, and you walk around looking at. Yeah, that's generally not how it works at all. So using using a Flutterwave story, for example, as a case in point. So to begin with, this wasn't necessarily a story that I sort of developed an organic interest in out of nowhere, and I decided to start.
So I think we are going to get into Flutterwave. So for our audience who don't know what Flutterwave, do you mind telling us what it is?
Right. So essentially it's a fintech startup which specializes in payment solutions. So stuff like payment gateways, payment fulfillment, when you use your card to make a payment on the website, that sort of thing. So basically, the financial infrastructure that makes it such that when you make an electronic payment, the money goes from your bank account or wherever to the bank account of the merchant you're making the purchase from. That whole ecosystem of financial infrastructure, Flutterwave is is the biggest startup operating in that space on the African continent. It's Africa's highest valued startup. It's valued just north of $3 billion. So it's Africa's highest valued tech startup. It's called a unicorn because any startup with a valuation in excess of $1 billion is called a unicorn. So that's what Flutterwave is right now. This actually started way back in 2021, right? I'd heard whispers. I mean, this was at this point, this was pretty much sort of like social media gossip. It wasn't anything that I even had any interest in, but I'd heard whispers that there were things that were less than acceptable going on behind the scenes at Flutterwave, right? I'd heard whispers about things like bosses sleeping with their subordinates that they work with, that sort of thing. But the thing is, so in the Nigerian context, that's not really a scandal, because in the Nigerian context, I mean, if you were to do an investigation into every business where a boss sleeps with his subordinates, I mean, you would never run out of investigations, basically. So again, as terrible as it sounds, in the Nigerian context, that's just not a scandal. It's just, it's like saying someone stole a piece of meat from his mother's pot or something. It's so common that, so it wasn't something I had really much interest in at the time. What changed was when I then started getting a series of anonymous emails from a character that I named in the story, right? Some anonymous character called Echo Minaj. Right, this person got hold of my encrypted email address, which I thought was interesting because I hadn't put that email address into the public domain. Like a few people had that email address. It's a Proton email address, an encrypted email address. It's not something I publicized. So for this person to have, done that amount of sort of background research into me to even get hold of my encrypted email address that wasn't public, just for the fact that this person put that much effort into tracking down my encrypted email address, because my public email address, I get loads of tips there on a daily basis. If we're lucky, I might get to work on 1 out of every 20 or 1 out of every 30 story tips there, because often they're not very high quality tips. But this person found my encrypted email address and started emailing me consistently and persistently. And it wasn't just random emails. These were emails, like the email threads that were attached to these emails had some very interesting information in them. Now, at the time, it's one thing to just see information in an email, but if there are no receipts, as we call them, if there's no evidence, you can't really do much with it, right? It's just, anyone can make an allegation and put the allegation in writing. It doesn't make it true. And in my line of work, because of the kind of journalism that I do, I always make a point that even if I know for a fact that something is true, if I can't visually prove it, if I don't have the visual evidence to prove it, I simply don't publish it, no matter how true I know it is. Like, if I know, for example, that your name is Renatus, like, unless I have a printout from your national identity card or your passport data page proving that this is your name, and I can actually publish that in my story, then I simply won't say it, right? Because how it works in my line of work is, the minute you publish anything that can be contested in any way, you have completely lost all your credibility. That's how it works. You can spend 10 years building credibility, and it takes one story, or it takes one part of one story to completely destroy it. That's just how it is. You're only as good as your last performance. That's how it works in this line of work. It's not fair, but it's how it is. You can't fight it. So so I started receiving these emails around September 2021. I didn't really do much with them because there wasn't really much that I could do with them. What changed was in March, I think. No, February 2022, when someone else then reached out to me, someone who had no knowledge of this other person, but it's also about Flutterwave. And this time it was basically a complaint about unpaid or stolen stock options, basically. That basically when this person got a job or was offered a job at Flutterwave, it was stated in the offer letter that they would be offered stock options, right? So how stock options work, for those who don't know, is when you start work at a startup which has a high growth potential, part of how the startup compensates you in addition to a salary, especially in an environment like Africa, where they might not be able to pay you the high salary that you get in Silicon Valley. So how they sort of make up for that to prevent them losing you as talent to maybe Silicon Valley, since you are at the same level of expertise as people who work in Silicon Valley, how they compensate you is they give you something called stock options. Now, how stock options work is, let's say this company has a total of 100,000 shares. Each share is valued at $10. So when you are coming in, maybe you are given stock options for 1,000 shares. Now, the idea is, if you stay with the company for a particular period of time, maybe 4 years or 5 years, then your stock options will vest. Vest means they mature and you can actually sell them, you can cash them out. And hopefully by that time, the value of these stocks would have actually risen, especially if the company has been able to raise money 2 or 3 times. Because each time the company raises money, the total valuation of the company goes up, and the share price or the stock price goes up as well. So when you hear the announcement saying a company has done a Series A funding, that means the company has raised money for the first time. It's done a Series B funding, is raised money for the second time, Series C, like that, and so on and so forth. So I think Flutterwave at the time had done its Series C funding. They had just raised $178 million for a total valuation of $3 billion. So I think each share at the time was worth something like $20. Bear in mind that just a few weeks before the raise, each share was worth about $3.50. So a few weeks after the raise was announced, the share price has gone up to about $20. Now, this person was complaining that even though she stayed for the stipulated time, she wasn't given her stock options, basically. And that basically the reason she wasn't given her stock options, like she was not officially awarded stock options, was because she refused to sleep with the boss, right? Because the boss basically was running the office as a slaughterhouse, to put it in street lingo. So basically, if he sleeps with you, then hopefully you will get what you want. And if you refuse to sleep with him, then you don't get anything. Also, the story went. So that was like the second thing that kind of piqued my interest. Why that one piqued my interest a bit more was there were legal documents attached, because this person had actually gone to the National Industrial Court. There was actually like an ongoing lawsuit as well. So I had access to like a plethora of files, which were on public record. So that was good. And then what then made me decide, okay, I'm actually really going to do a story about this, was the very next month, I think it was, then a whistleblower from within the company who had left only recently then reached out to me. And this time, and they had a ton of receipts, right? And receipts, as a journalist, receipts are my favorite things, right? Because with receipts, your story can be established beyond any point of doubt or beyond any reproach, right? Because when you report a story and it's he said versus she said, how it works in Nigeria or in Africa, in fact, is that people will just say that you're lying, you made it up. That somebody paid you to demarket X person or X organization. You're not a real journalist. You should go back to journalism school, or you've collected a brown envelope. So, somebody bribed you. You're a terrible person. That's what you get normally if you can't publish, visual evidence. So I love receipts, and this person had all of the receipts. So then I started working on the story. Now, it was very interesting that almost around that exact time, Flutterwave then got into a public dispute with another one of its ex-employees, a lady called Clara Odero. And she's Kenyan. And basically the complaints that she made publicly when there was this back and forth between herself and Flutterwave were also very useful in putting parts of the story together, right? So in April last year was when this story was published. Now, I'm not sure I want to sort of like give it like a whole outline of the story all over again, so that we don't take too much time. So I'll just spend like 1 minute running through it. So essentially there were three parts of the story. So the first part was the lady that I said who was in court with Flutterwave for not being awarded her stock options. So there was that. So there was this whole thing about stock options at Flutterwave. So it wasn't just her. There were other people who, for all sorts of arbitrary reasons, were either not awarded their stock options, or even if they were awarded stock options, they weren't allowed to sell them at market price. So if, as I said, the stocks were worth $20, they're only allowed to sell to a particular an investment vehicle called Berrywood Capital, which was owned by the CEO himself, GB. So essentially, you're only allowed to sell your shares to the CEO of the company himself, and then he would tell you at what price he would buy it from you. So the market value is $20. He'll buy it from you for $3.50. Right? So you get like a tiny fraction of the value of what you've actually worked for. And then obviously, being that he has got these highly valued shares at this very steep discount, he can then go to the secondary market and then sell those shares at their true value and pocket the difference for himself. And then put that money back into Berrywood Capital. And, so it's like he was running a scam on his own employees, basically. So Berrywood Capital became like his little slush fund. Not became, it is his little slush fund. And another thing that was very interesting while putting that story together was that I then came to realize that Berrywood Capital owns significant stakes in pretty much every major significant Nigerian tech company you can think of. Pretty much all of them. So basically, the very interesting thing when putting this story together was that the number of people who, when I tried to speak to them, as soon as they heard the name Flutterwave, would just completely lock up on me. They don't want to talk. And it's basically because the founder of Flutterwave is on their cap table. He's on everybody's cap table in the tech industry in Nigeria or in West Africa. He owns everybody, basically. So that's how he sort of kept himself protected for all these years. So regardless of whatever chicanery was going on under the hood, no one ever went after him because this guy is basically, this guy, he's in everybody's investment cap table. His money's in everybody's pockets.
Got everyone on the payroll.
Yeah, exactly. That's how he kept himself ring-fenced. So there was that. There was the issue with stock options, which, by the way, according to the Securities and Exchange Commission in America, is classified as fraud. And bear in mind, Flutterwave is registered in Delaware, so it's an American corporation technically. So it's subject to US law. So there was that. Then the second bit, and in my opinion, the most important bit, which most people didn't realize was the most important bit, but the most important bit was the bit about insider dealing and fraud at Flutterwave. Now, insider dealing being that the founder of Flutterwave, a guy called Bola, or GB as is popularly known, for 2 years while he was building Flutterwave, was still working at Access Bank concurrently without the knowledge of the bank. Now, Flutterwave was essentially built out using Access Bank resources. Was essentially the CEO of Access Bank basically was under the impression that this guy was building out a solution called capture payment solutions for Access Bank. And instead, this technology solution he was building was actually Flutterwave under the hood, right? And it wasn't registered to Access Bank or to the CEO of Access Bank, so it was registered to GB. So he essentially used the resources of a bank. And by the way, Access Bank is, I think, the second largest bank by cap volume in Nigeria. So it's a huge bank in Nigeria, right? So use the resources of a bank to build out a tech startup, and was essentially directing traffic from the bank basically to Flutterwave. So essentially, if you were doing business with Access Bank at the time, if you were doing any kind of payment fulfillment using Access Bank at the time, you found yourself using Flutterwave because GB, who was in charge of that part of Access Bank, was also the founder of Flutterwave. So he was sort of, how do I use the word? He was cannibalizing Access Bank to build out his own, to benefit his own private corporate interests. So for example, Uber Nigeria, bear in mind, Uber is a huge global business. Uber came into Nigeria within what, eight months of Flutterwave approaching them. Uber started processing all their payments in Nigeria via Flutterwave. How is that possible? A new company, and Uber becomes one of your first clients. How is that possible? How did that happen?
And Uber is a massive company.
Exactly. And the reason that happened is because Uber was processing through Access Bank. And then this was pushed to Flutterwave, right? So there was a huge thing about insider dealing there, which is also illegal, by the way, both under US law and Nigerian law. And then the other thing, the fraud bits, which in my opinion was why Flutterwave got into trouble in Ghana and Kenya, and I think in South Africa as well. Essentially, the company was doing some very shady things under the hood. One of the things they were doing was overstating the number and volume of transactions that they were doing. Now, bear in mind that this is a company that makes money by charging a fee on every transaction it processes. So the higher the number of transactions it processes, the more the money it makes. And the more the money it makes, as far as the investor is concerned, the higher the value of the company, right? So in South Africa, for example, what they were doing was, because they were also processing for Uber in South Africa. So what would happen, for example, is you take an Uber ride in Joburg or Cape Town, and maybe the fare is 10 rands. Instead of that revenue getting booked as 10 rands, it will get booked as 10 USD. So with a stroke of the pen, you have multiplied the actual amount of revenue by 12 or by 10 times, right? Obviously, the actual amount of money that's coming to the company isn't that amount. It's still the 12 rands that came in. It wasn't $12. But on the books, you recorded it as $12. So what you present to the investors is this like hyperinflated thing that doesn't actually exist, right? Something else they were doing in Nigeria, they were doing this thing called double charging. So you would make a payment, maybe you'd buy flight tickets, because at the time they were processing, I think, for Arik Air. So the flight ticket cost maybe 50,000 naira. And what would always happen is you would get debited for 50,000 naira twice, and then 50,000 naira would be reverted to you. So you only paid 50,000 naira, right? However, there are two transactions on the books. There are two
on the books.
Yeah, there are two 50,000 naira credit transactions on the books. So for every 50,000 naira transaction you made on Arik using Flutterwave has booked 100,000 naira. And that's what it's showing to the investors. So there was just all sorts of fraud going on under the hood. Something else they were doing, I don't know if they stopped doing this, was what was it now? This wasn't even like transactional fraud. This was more of like a tangential kind of fraud. There was a time, I think this was in 2018, or was it 2019? There was this huge consumer data leak from Arik Air that was noticed. Some guy on GitHub, some American guy, I think, noticed that he was able to get into the what's it called? Like an unsecured data bucket containing thousands of Nigerian consumers' information, card details and stuff, customers of Arik Air. And there was a huge scandal at the time. And what this whistleblower within it, because at the time, Flutterwave came out and denied that they had anything to do with it. They said the problem was from Arik, and Arik said the problem wasn't from them. So it was like this hot potato. And, you know, in Nigeria, the news cycle moves really quickly. So everyone just kind of forgot, swept under the carpet. But this whistleblower revealed that it was actually Flutterwave that was hacked, basically, because they stored this info. Consumers' financial information was stored in unsecured buckets in plain text format, unencrypted. So basically, some guy from GitHub, who wasn't even a hacker per se, was able to get into this data bucket and find, you know, people's debit card details, all sorts of things like that, like thousands. So you can imagine what that potentially had done, the number of people whose financial details had potentially been exposed.
Was at risk.
Why was that done? Apparently because the web hosting at the time, and, you know, when the source told me this, I almost didn't want to believe it because it just sounded so crazy. But the source insisted that this actually happened. Apparently at the time, the company's web hosting wasn't being done with Amazon Web Solutions. It was being done with some random company, which apparently the co-founder's mom owned. So basically, the company is paying for web hosting at the level of AWS, but it's some backroad hosting company
in the garage,
which obviously cannot do it at the same level that AWS can do it. So someone is pocketing the difference. So at every step of the way, this company that on the outside looks like this marvelous, fantastic African success story, the founders are literally just eating eating the company from
Pocketing the
within.
money.
Yeah, they're literally eating the company and deceiving investors. Now, for me, what was probably the most interesting part of this section of the story was that this whistleblower also made it very clear to me that the investors knew all of this.
They knew what was going on?
They knew what was going on because they had been tipped off multiple times. However, and this is a very important thing, apparently how tech investment works, not just in Africa, but in the world, is we don't really care whether you do the things you claim you are doing. What we care about is that that stock price should keep going up. And when it reaches a certain target level, we sell our stock, we take our profits, and we leave the bag for the greater fool who bought it. You understand?
Sign out.
Yeah, that greater fool marketplace theory, that apparently is how tech investment works, not just in Africa, but in Silicon Valley as well, across the world, which is why you keep on seeing these high-profile incidences of fraud in tech, because the investors are not stupid. They know. However, all of them are like, you know what? If we start pulling out our money now, we start panicking, we're all going to take a loss because it's going to quickly become apparent that this company is a lie. So instead, let's all keep speaking positively about it. Let's all keep pumping that price. Let's all keep giving everyone the impression that this company is growing so that the price keeps trending upward. And then let's quietly sell down our stake and then exit and then leave it for someone else. Yeah, let someone else carry the bag. So the investors all knew about this. They were not in the dark about it. They had been tipped off multiple times. And they were like, you know what? Something else, before I go to the final section of the story, something else that they were also doing was one of the co-founders, a guy called Adeleke Adekoya. So he also worked at Access Bank. So both he and GB were working at Access Bank, and we're also founding Flutterwave concurrently. So it was so weird because it got even to the point of the email signatures. They edited their Flutterwave email signatures to not include their names. So if, for example, someone is sending an email, someone is forwarding an email from the Flutterwave CEO to anybody in Access Bank, it doesn't show Benga Bola, it shows co-founder. So basically they were hiding their involvement in Flutterwave from their own colleagues at Access Bank. So there's actually a WhatsApp exchange that I published in the story where GB is speaking to a subordinate and he's telling him that there's like a remote meeting and that he's going to attend this meeting as Access Bank. So it's a Flutterwave meeting with Access Bank, and GB is attending that meeting as the Access Bank representative.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
It's absolutely insane. So just the sheer amount of audacity involved. So he's because he's actually working at Access Bank. He is actually the Access Bank representative in that meeting, but he's intentionally, it's like a staged meeting almost. The point of it is to push business to Flutterwave, right? So the person who is representing Flutterwave has been coached on what to say, while GB and Leke are representing Access Bank, supposedly, even though they have financial interest in Flutterwave, they own it. So that's how that works. So apparently, this co-founder, this Adeleke Adekoya fellow, was actually also he was actually fired from MasterCard because it was discovered that he was using his. So okay, let me back up a bit. After officially like resigning from Access Bank a couple of years later, and then GB stayed on at Flutterwave. Leke moved on from Flutterwave after a while, moved on to a role at MasterCard. He then got fired from MasterCard. And apparently the reason was he was using his position at MasterCard to push business toward Flutterwave, where he had a financial interest. Apparently an undisclosed financial interest. So apparently the people at MasterCard didn't really know that this person we've just given a job to potentially has a huge conflict of interest here because this person has a financial stake in this company, which in some ways is our client, but in some ways also our competitor. They didn't know that. So he's basically like taking MasterCard, like speaking to MasterCard clients directly and telling them, hey, come and process with Flutterwave. We can give you this and that incentive, that sort of thing. And obviously, the more people who are coming to process with Flutterwave, the higher the stock value of Flutterwave goes, the more money is in his own pockets. You know how that works. And then the final part of the story, which probably the least interesting part of the story, but which most people picked up on because that's what got their senses pulsing, was the sexual environment at Flutterwave. So apparently, and that's where this Echo Minaj character comes in. Because this was apparently a lady at Flutterwave who considered herself to be a scorned woman. Because apparently she had slept with GB multiple times, both GB and the COO, a guy called Ife Orioke. Both men are married, by the way, with children. Just putting that out there. So apparently she had slept with both of them multiple times because she had been promised that she was going to get, stock options. I don't think she was entitled to stock options, but I think she had been promised that she was going to get stock options. And then like they used her as a plaything. And then she realized that they were also using the other ladies in the office as playthings as well. And that basically none of them was going to get anything. Like these men were pretty much just having fun with them and pretty much using them as toys by dangling that promise of stock options in front of them. Because the truth is that those stock options can be life-changing. And people do things they wouldn't normally do when money is involved. So if someone is dangling stock options worth $800,000 in front of your nose, you might consider yourself to be like a church girl and all that. But when you see $800,000 dangling in front of your nose, then you discover your inner bad bee,
Becomes to fall for it.
Exactly, which is pretty much what was happening. So she led this email campaign, this very angry email campaign to Flutterwave investors, informing them about all the things that have been happening. And apparently it was even, I think she was actually partly responsible for tipping off investors as to what was going on within Flutterwave, even financially. But the investors did nothing about it. So there's some of the big global tech investment funds you can think of, Greycroft, Tiger, they're all invested in Flutterwave. And they did absolutely nothing. We're very happy. You know what? This guy is making us money. This stock price only keeps going up. So, whatever people have to say, that's not really our business. We are here to make money. We're not here to be HR, basically. So, there are two secret recordings which are embedded in that story. The first one was a town hall meeting that was held shortly after investors received one of those emails from this Echo Minaj person, and they called a meeting with GB. And I think that email actually got to a potential investor, someone who was in talks with Flutterwave. And because of that email, that fund backed out. So I think there was something like $20 million or something that sort of left because of that email. So GB was really angry. So he called this town hall, and he was basically trying to address these things about sexual harassment. And essentially what he was saying in the tape recording, which is in the story, was that, look, what adults do outside of working hours is not anybody else's business. So essentially, like what he was saying was that whether he's sleeping with his subordinates or not, it doesn't concern anybody. As long as it's consensual, as long as it's not rape, he's not doing anything wrong. So, and then, that he's gonna start, instituting like office surveillance to make sure that, people like this don't hurt the company again. So then they started putting like keyloggers and spyware on people's work computers, that sort of thing, to try and smoke out who the rat was. They never successfully found out who the person was. I mean, I have my hunches, but obviously, I'm not going to say who I think it is or who I believe it is, but that's fine. And then the second secret recording I was able to get was of somebody who, I mean, I think her identity is pretty much public now, but I'm not going to say it. So I'll use the name that was assigned to her in the story, right? So the name that was given to her in the story was Tammy, I think. So this was a phone call, a call recording of her speaking to someone. And in that recording, she's basically saying that, look, the day she writes a blog post and tells the world about what she witnessed at Flutterwave and the things that happened at Flutterwave, that she's going to shut the company down. And basically what that recording was the inference in that recording was basically she was the one who was most affected by this sexual impropriety, because apparently she was well known around the office for being, for lack of a better term, GB's toy, right? GB was toying with a lot of women, but she specifically was known in the office for being the one who is GB's toy, to the point where she's the one that he takes with him to go on trips to the US, and like account only pays for one hotel room, and both of them are lodging in the same hotel room, that sort of thing. So it wasn't exactly a secret, you understand, that sort of thing. So there's a secret recording of her, which is embedded in the story. I kind of like use digital tools to alter her voice a bit. So I pitched it down so people who like her voice wouldn't be like identifiable. And then I subtitled it. So yeah, it was a story that raised a lot of dust. I was informed actually by an investor who called me the day after it was published. She said that story on its own might have shaved off maybe $100 million worth of market value from the company, just that story on its own. So that should give you an idea of the extent to which certain people don't like me. Because I mean, if you're costing people that kind of money, then
yeah, I don't suppose they're happy with that.
No, they're not at all.
Wow, that's a very detailed analysis. And how did people react after you had published the article? What was the reaction like?
It was mostly so there was a perception that I had some kind of a personal grouse with the company, because there are a number of people who are affiliated with the company. Because one funny thing that company used to do, or still does, was instead of just being like a simple tech startup, which it is, it tries to sort of like portray itself as some sort of like sexy lifestyle brand or something. And it's literally it's a payment gateway. Payment gateways have existed since the 80s in the developed world, but it tries to sort of position itself as this sort of super sexy, 23rd century kind of thing, because it's like an internet-based. So they hire influencers on social media. They sponsor podcasts. They sponsor Big Brother Nigeria, by the way. They do a lot of like really youthful and hip stuff. So there are a number of people, some of whom I don't like and some of whom don't like me, who are affiliated with the company in that way. They have sponsorships and work with the company. So there was this mistaken perception that, oh, because David doesn't like this person, that's why David is going after this person's sponsor. But then when you read the full story, it becomes very clear that, okay, this is not like a surface attack on a company that somebody doesn't like. This is a very detailed investigation into fraud, right? This is something very serious going on here. So the initial reaction was, for like an hour or so, was like skepticism that, let me read this thing first. And then afterwards it becomes, oh my God, how is this company still open? Like, why isn't the EFCC, that's the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, why aren't they doing anything? Why isn't the central bank doing anything? Like, this is open fraud happening, blah, 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 blah. And that was pretty much the reaction. And then, as usual, Nigeria being Nigeria, nothing happened.
Nothing happened. How did that make you feel, given all the work that you've put into write such a piece?
So again, I'm not going to pretend that I'm Iron Man. I'm not. It does piss me off. That, and it's not just that story. It's a recurring thing actually in some of the work that I do. So I would say 40% of the stories that I do end up having a definite measurable impact. So there are some stories, for example, I did an investigation into Chinese loan sharks in Nigeria last year, these loan apps. And like maybe 40 days after the story was published, the very entities that I examined in the story, they were raided by the FCCPC, they were shut down, and a probe was instituted. You know, the banks involved, the consulting company involved, and the apps themselves, they were forced to go into hiding. So a lot of the time, my stories have that kind of definite measurable impact. That's like 40% of the time. But the other 60% of the time, you do this very, very, very detailed, elaborate story that basically does the work of the police for them. And literally all they have to do is go and make an arrest. Like, the work has been done for you. It's been laid on a platter for you. Take. And then nothing happens. And it's the most frustrating thing in the world. It's so incredibly frustrating. So like in this case, like they actually faced more consequences outside of Nigeria as a consequence of that story than within Nigeria. So in Ghana, for example, shortly after the story was published, the Ghanaian, the GCB, that's the Bank of Ghana, that's the Ghanaian Central Bank, put out a circular basically stating that no bank in Ghana is permitted to work with this company anymore and any longer. Till today, that ban persists, right? That was a result of this story. But within Nigeria, which is the biggest jurisdiction where this company operates, and which was where the audience of this story was for, nothing happened. And obviously, I couldn't put this in the story, but the reason why nothing happened, I was informed categorically by that whistleblower within the company again, but because there are no receipts, I couldn't publish it. But this is a podcast, I'm going to say it. Basically, there are elements within the Nigerian Central Bank who have financial interest in Flutterwave. So essentially, the regulator is not neutral. The regulator also has an interest here. So it's not in the regulator's personal interest for them to regulate, because if they do their job, then, you know, this company is going to lose share valuation or whatever. They're going to lose money. They're going to lose a source of income. So instead, just sort of look the other way and pretend that this huge investigation that the world is talking about didn't happen. You know, because it was huge. I mean, it made it to, it was, LinkedIn has this daily, basically like they push like the most interesting or the most important articles from the previous day, like 3 of them, they push to all their users globally. This story was on that the day after it was published. LinkedIn pushed this story, like, you know, and so this story went around the world. Everyone read it, except in Nigeria, where the government just decided that they were going to avert their eyes and pretend that nothing happened. To date, there has been not a single enforcement action taken against this company in Nigeria.
I mean, and I wouldn't be surprised, because clearly you have people above the chain who are pulling the strings.
Exactly.
When you speak about Nigeria, one of the words that comes to people's mind is fraud. And the whole story of Flutterwave is really a proof of that, right? Why do you think Nigeria is always associated with fraud?
So I think it's an unfortunate sequence of accidents that makes it such that Nigeria is viewed as some sort of like a jurisdiction that is specially linked to fraud. So if you look at the actual data, globally, Nigeria is not even, I think, in the top 12 or the top 13 countries for internet fraud globally. However, what Nigeria does have that most other countries don't have is this cultural tendency to be very loud, right? So when the North Koreans or the Russians or the Americans or the Chinese, who are by far bigger in the global cybercrime space than Nigerians are, when they are doing their scams worth billions of dollars, you don't hear anything about it. They keep everything they do very quiet. They don't drive flashy cars. You don't see them, right? Even if they live ostentatiously, in closed, gated neighborhoods where you can't see them. They don't have Instagram pages.
They keep a low profile.
Exactly. In Nigeria, however, you have a guy like Ramon Abbas, who you might know as Hush Puppy, who does a scam for maybe $10 million, right? Which, I mean, in personal terms, $10 million is a lot of money, but in global terms, it's absolutely nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. But with that $10 million, he buys a Rolls-Royce Phantom. He buys a luxury mansion in Dubai. He lives this huge, like ostentatious Instagram lifestyle. He gets a verified page on Instagram. He's always showing off this Cartier watch or something. He's just constantly attracting attention until people inevitably start to ask, what does this person do for a living? And then inevitably the answer that comes back is this person is into cybercrime. So when you have 100, 200, 300, 1,000, 2,000 such people who have similar backstories and they're all Nigerians, then obviously what then tends to happen is people now start to associate Nigeria with fraud, with cybercrime. Meanwhile, in actual financial terms, Nigerians are a drop in the bucket. Like they're absolutely nobody. But because culturally, Nigeria is very different to most other African countries in terms of just our sheer loudness. We have very, very, very loud people. Very loud people. And I don't think there's any Nigerian you will meet on earth that would deny it. We have very loud people. Culturally, we're not very humble people. We can be quite aggressive, can be quite overbearing, can be quite domineering. We always like to have our point of view heard. Sometimes that can be a good thing. But this is one of those instances where it is definitely a minus, because that lack of self-awareness, that lack of that constant need to be noticed is what has created this unfortunate idea that Nigerians somehow do more cybercrime than others. Nigerians don't actually do more cybercrime than even Ghanaians. But again, it's just that thing of who makes the most noise,
who's loud.
When you do the scam or whatever, the money that you make from it, what do you do with it? The other people go invest their money back home quietly. They go buy a supermarket or invest in some factory or something. Like, there are all sorts of huge manufacturing operations around the world that are funded by dirty money, and you will never know. But in Nigeria, that dirty money is never used for anything productive. It goes straight into the luxury sector. Someone is buying a house, buying a car, starts dating Naomi Campbell. I think one of the very worst things, there are lots of things I love about the Nigerian psychological makeup, but I think one of the things I dislike the most about it is that it always feels a need to announce itself, even when there isn't really anything to announce. So it's very ostentatious. It's always bragging. It needs to be noticed. It has a very fragile ego. So when in a place like South Africa, for example, I know there's a very widespread perception that in places like South Africa, Kenya, that the Nigerian men that they're either doing fraud, petty scams or whatever, or they're doing drugs. There's that perception. And the reason that perception exists is because the Nigerians that are there who do those things do their utmost to ensure that the whole world sees them doing those things and that the whole world associates them with doing those things. Again, that loudness, sometimes it can be a good thing. Sometimes assertiveness can be a good thing. But a lot of the time, it's one of the biggest liabilities about, just being a Nigerian. And it's something that even I find myself consciously having to sort of push back on, like inside my own head sometimes when I'm in certain situations, especially since I came into this space where I have to sort of constantly look over my shoulder. I have to live with a very low profile. Like, this is not the kind of job where you go around announcing yourself, because you will get a bullet in it. I've had to learn over the past 3 to 4 years how to walk into a room and not be noticed. How to sort of
live like a ghost.
Exactly. How to just be part of the furniture in a room, which is a skill that many other people on planet Earth have. But I can tell you for free, Nigerians don't have it. We just can't help it. So, and even plugging that into Flutterwave, for example, I think part of the reason why because I don't know if you followed the Kenyan angle of the story, when the Assets Recovery Agency in Kenya then they temporarily banned Flutterwave from operating in Kenya. and then they froze 56 bank accounts linked to Flutterwave, and they were able to show some sort of empirical evidence that there was something closely resembling money laundering going on. Now, why did that even happen in the first place? It
What is
happened,
money laundering before you
right?
proceed?
Okay, so to put it in very basic terms, um, you have stolen 10,000 rands, right? Now, instead of simply going to buy what you want, maybe you want to buy a car. Instead of just going to buy the car with 10,000 rands, which would attract attention, and people start to ask you, where did you get that money from? How could you afford this car? What you then do is you go to your backyard, you connect your hose pipe to a tap, and you put out a sign saying that you started washing cars, and you're charging 500 rands for a car wash. Obviously, nobody's going to pay 500 rands for a car wash, but then you keep your records showing that for 10 days, 2 people came every day to wash their cars, paying 500 rands each. So you made 1,000 rands per day for 10 days. So you've made 10,000 rands. And that's how you made your 10,000 rands. And then you can take that record to a bank, deposit your money to an account, and use that record as proof of where this money came from, because the bank is obviously going to ask you, where did this money come from? You can then show them these receipts that I run a car wash, and these are my cash receipts from my business. And then the bank will accept the money, and then you can then take that money, which has then been claimed or laundered. That's why it's called money laundering. You claim the money. That money has just been cleaned, and then you can take it and buy the car, and nobody can ask you any questions. So the Assets Recovery Agency in Kenya had presented some sort of empirical evidence showing that this company was involved in some form of money laundering. So, for example, you will see transactions where the transaction is originating, the money came from Nigeria, right? The money has been transferred to Kenya. And this money, like, so typically how it works is if a large sum of money comes in from another jurisdiction, like cross-border, like from Nigeria to Kenya, and then you instantly withdraw that money, and then maybe you use it to buy a house or something, the financial authorities that are immediately going to start asking questions, because the transaction is going to be flagged. Where did this money come from? Who are you? What did you do to get hold of this money? That kind of thing. So instead of doing that directly, what they then do is they then sort of so the money comes in from this company's account in Nigeria to this company's account in Kenya. Then this company in Kenya pays into this other company's account in Kenya, and it moves like that from this company account to that company account. And each time there's an explanation attached to it, that this payment for this or this payment for that, and maybe it's cycled around maybe 200 times before it then gets to the final destination. At which point there's an explanation for how that money came to be in this person's possession, and then this person can use it for whatever they want to use it for. So the Kenyan ARA was able to show documentation proving that this was where all of this came from. But ultimately, why did the Kenyan authorities even get wind of this? Was Flutterwave the only company that was doing stuff like this? Probably not. But why was it Flutterwave specifically that they got? Because the Nigerians, because the people involved in Nigerians, they live a very, very, very noticeable lifestyle in Nairobi. People have started asking questions. So there's a guy who, he's funny enough, he's now a son-in-law to the current Kenyan president, which might explain why the case was dropped very, under very sort of murky circumstances. His name is Alex Izinago. Like, he lives in Nairobi, right? If you get to spend time with these people for like a week or so, you almost feel as if you're in Beverly Hills, right? So, and the truth is that, you can call it xenophobia, you can call it whatever you want to call it, but the truth is that when you're in another person's country, you are more noticeable just by default. You just are, right? Especially when it's in Africa. The truth is that the vast majority of Africa is poor. The vast majority of Africans are poor. That's the reality. So when you are in another country in Africa, and then you all of a sudden appear to just be inexplicably wealthy in a way that maybe they've never really seen before, questions will be asked, right? And once those questions are asked, and the questions get to the authorities, who then start looking into one or two things, that might lead to enforcement action. So it may not be that you are the only one who is doing these things, but it may just be that because you are the one who couldn't help but do things to be noticed. You are the one who was wearing, Gucci'd out from cap to toe. You are the one who was driving the latest Mercedes-Benz S-Class. You are the one who, you just had to live a lifestyle that is as noticeably ostentatious as possible. Then you get fingered, not just as the one who does scams or the one who does cybercrime, but you get fingered as the one who does the most. They call you a cybercrime kingpin. Nigerians are not cybercrime kingpins or anything close to it. Anything close to it.
Is this a title that they enjoy?
Some people do, actually. Some people, to some people, the most important thing is to be recognized as successful. In as much as that success might be, success of the sort you shouldn't be proud of, but to some people, just being recognized as successful, especially when surrounded by people who are less successful, to some people, that's an achievement, that's an accomplishment. So some people actually enjoy it. Some people actually think the fact that you are being constantly noticed a certain way, especially around the continent, that is like a badge of honor. In my line of work, I've come to understand that it's not a badge of honor because it can get you killed. So it's that excess attention, you don't want it. I've spent a lot of time traveling around Africa over the past 3 years, and I've learned to develop that skill to just not be noticed. Even if it's something as simple as you're at an airport and someone there is being unnecessarily rude to you, I've learned to tamp down on my instinctual response, which is to give it back to you. That who do you think you're talking to? That kind of thing. I've learned that, you know what, this probably won't end well. So let's just not.
You don't want to attract attention.
Yeah, let me get back to a safe space first, and then let me have a huge rant about it on Twitter, where it's safe. But for now, where something can be done to put me in trouble, let me just not. So, but I think the norm within a lot of contemporary Nigerian culture is to be very blasé, to be very out there. So I think part of the reason for this is that for many years, there was this like being African wasn't cool, right? For many years, especially outside of the continent, it wasn't cool. Right, the way like when I lived in the UK back in the day, loads of Ghanaians and Nigerians used to say that they were Jamaican because being Caribbean was cool, but being African wasn't cool. Over the past decade or so, that has changed completely. So there has been this African cultural renaissance, and in Nigeria specifically, one of the forms that this renaissance has come in is people no longer shrink away from these negative labels that are applied to Nigerians. People rather own them. So if you say I do like cybercrime or whatnot, I then sort of flip it. Even if I don't actually do cybercrime, I sort of flip it and I own it and I throw it back at you that, yeah, I do it. And I drive this car and I do it and blah, blah, blah. What are you doing? Kind of thing. So to you might see that and be shocked that, why on earth would someone be proud of this? But to some other people, to them, it's just them expressing some sort of newfangled nationalistic pride, which they didn't have maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So there are many reasons why these things happen.
Forged documents, identity theft, and false claims. Nigerians elections. What has been going on in Nigerian elections? And you wrote a very detailed investigative piece and was published on November 17th, 2022. And what impact did that piece or that investigative article have on the minds of young Nigerians?
So I think even before that article was published, I think the more impactful work I had done concerning these elections was a story called From Drug Lord to Presidential Candidate, Bola Ahmed Tinubu. Now, that story, which also had a YouTube documentary, I think was what traveled the most around Nigeria, especially the young Nigerian demographic. The November story was just kind of like an addendum to that. I think what that initial story did was that this guy who we first became familiar with him in 1999 when he became a governor in Lagos, when, after the military dictator died and we had democracy again in 99. So despite the fact that this guy had been in the public eye for what, 20 something years, the truth is nobody really knew who he was. And I thought that was absolutely absurd. You can't have someone running for president who has a real chance of actually becoming president, and nobody knows what this person's backstory is. Nobody, a very dangerous trend I had observed starting from 2015. In 2015, I was working in marketing at the time in Lagos. And even though I didn't work on the presidential campaign in 2015, some of the sister agencies of the agencies that I worked with were very closely involved in the campaign. So some of my colleagues worked on the campaign. So I got to see like very up close what a political campaign was in Nigeria. And I was absolutely horrified because people would just throw out just complete BS. They will say things like, this candidate is going to make the Naira equal to the dollar. And then like the media will start running with it. And it's like, how? Like based on what numbers, based on what data, based on what metrics, how can you just say things and it just flies? Nobody does any attempt at fact checking anything. Like there's just, anybody just says absolutely anything with no consequences whatsoever. People were throwing out like these ethno-racial narratives that is this, this particular tribe should not be allowed to vote. Just all sorts of like really out there stuff. So like you're South African, right? So you can imagine if someone in, I don't know, KwaZulu-Natal wakes up one morning, someone with a huge social media audience wakes up one morning and says, all vendor people shouldn't be allowed to vote in South Africa or something like that. Like,
and why do you think such campaigns gain momentum? Is it that people don't think about them or they don't want to reflect and they just, they accept anything that they're being told?
So I think, and this is something I've had a lot of arguments about. I think one of the key differences between a country like Nigeria, the politics of a country like Nigeria, and the politics of countries like maybe Kenya, South Africa, is that in living memory, you guys have some sort of idea of what it meant to actually fight for freedom or independence. So being South African actually means something to you. It's actually an identity. So it doesn't stop you from being Xhosa or Zulu or whatever, but being South African is still a meaningful identity. It means something to you. The same way being Kenyan means something to Kenyans because they actually fought for independence and they suffered greatly for it. In Nigeria, we didn't really have any such thing, right? There was an independence campaign, but there was no sort of like independence struggle in the classic African sense, like a bush war, that sort of thing.
The Maji kind of thing.
Yeah, the truth is that Nigeria was so large that it wasn't really possible to keep Nigeria colonized as soon as some sort of campaign began. And the British were weakened after the Second World War. So it happened so rapidly. And in fact, you might be surprised to know that when the motion for independence was raised initially in the parliament in Nigeria in 1956, I think it was, half of the country actually voted against it. Yeah.
Voted against getting independence.
And the reason was, as far as they were concerned, the governance structures that they had depended on the British. The civil service, everything was staffed by the British. So if they leave, basically, we're going to collapse. We don't have anything going for us. So before they leave, we need to start training our own people to be able to take over this. So that's how it was seen. So our experience of colonization and your experience were very different. So as a result of that, the concept of being Nigerian doesn't really mean much to most Nigerians. So most Nigerians, being Nigerian is just, it means that that's what it says on your passport. To most Nigerians, the most meaningful identity is their ethnic identity. So you are Yoruba, you are Igbo, you are Efik, you are Hausa, you are Ibibio, you are you are Anang, you are, Kalabari. Those are what actually mean something to most people. So there's just an idea called Nigeria. But most, to you, being so, like when you sing the South African national anthem, it does something to you. You actually,
I
even if
I
you don't,
actually sing the Tanzanian national anthem.
right. So that actually means something to you. You guys also had an independence struggle, right? These things happened generally across Africa the same way, but in Nigeria it wasn't like that. There was no real independence struggle, like an armed struggle or anything where people died. No.
So in a way, do you think that the independence struggles that most African countries went through united them such that they have a sense of nationality and a culture that they share that Nigeria misses?
I mean, I don't know about united them, because I know African countries still have, issues with ethnicity and tribal tussles, but I think it definitely gave them a sense of national identity.
Ah, okay.
So, such that so there are Swahili speaking people in both Kenya and Tanzania, but be that as it may, the Kenyan ones and the Tanzanian ones still identify themselves as Kenyan and Tanzanian. It's not because we both speak the same language, then we're both the same thing across national boundaries. That's not how it works. Whereas in Nigeria, the Fufu speaking people, the Fulani people in the northeastern or the northwestern parts of the country, and the people from Niger Republic who are the same ethnic group, they see themselves as one thing. So literally the Nigerian border on the northwest is more of like a suggestion. It's not a real border. It's not manned. Like it's a suggestion. People live across the border lines, because as far as they're concerned, whatever line exists is just a line that was drawn by some white man in Berlin. It doesn't mean anything to them. So the entire concept of Nigeria, as far as they're concerned, Nigeria was something that was created by British people in Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin. So Nigeria doesn't really, and that's part of the reason why Nigerians treat Nigeria the way we do, because Nigerians genuinely don't respect Nigeria at all. Nigeria is just
I think that in a way could explain the mass exodus of youth in Nigeria. And, it has even become a popular trend, Japa.
Exactly. Because what exactly does it mean to be Nigerian in the first place? Nigeria is just a place you happen to be born into. And then if you're lucky, you can make a lot of money there. It's like a farm or it's a marketplace. But do people really think of Nigeria as home? They might think of like where their ethnic group comes from as home, but Nigeria, like if I come from Lagos, do I think of Adamawa as home? I certainly don't. But whereas in your case, if you come from the northern part of Tanzania, you might still feel some sort of affinity for another part of the country because being Tanzanian actually means something. So that's the very, very key difference between how Nigerians see themselves and how other Africans see themselves, which I think is very unfortunate, but it is what it is.
David, who is Bola Ahmed Tinubu?
So he's a politician who apparently we're made to believe is now the president-elect of Nigeria. If you draw the line back far enough, his life becomes a complete and utter mystery. Who are his parents? Nobody knows. Where was he born? Nobody knows. What's his date of birth or how old is he now? Nobody knows. At what age did he find his way to Lagos and become the person we know today? Again, nobody really knows. So the traceable part of his story starts from sometime in the mid-1970s, where he arrived in Chicago in the US. He went to Richard J. Daley College, which is a community college in Chicago. Supposedly afterwards attended Chicago State University and graduated in 1979. Supposedly then got a job at Deloitte, which is an accounting firm. And then afterwards supposedly got a job at Mobil Oil. And then afterward came back to Nigeria and went into politics in 1992, where he was elected into the House of Senate. And then just over a year later, the 1993 elections were annulled, and Nigeria went back into a military regime, which lasted for 6 years between 1993 and 1999. And then 1999, when he came back, he ran for governor of Lagos State and he won. And from the moment when he won to when he finished his second term in office in 2007, he had been building up this sort of arsenal of political operatives and sycophants and wealth to basically sort of perpetuate him in power even after he had to leave office. So then he basically handpicked his successor and handpicked every other successor since then. So he's like the de facto godfather of Lagos. That's the official story. Now, the real story is that the person who, and by the way, the reason why we know this to be the real story is that all of these institutions that I've mentioned were subpoenaed to provide records of the person known as Bola Ahmed Tinubu or Bola A. Tinubu.
So before you proceed, how does the INEC process look like such that someone is able to run for the highest office in the country and that all this information is not known? How serious is that?
So the issue with INEC, and which I think was something that was deliberately written into the Electoral Act to make INEC toothless, is that by law, INEC does not have the power to verify the information provided by candidates. So by law, what happens is that the candidates submit something called a sworn affidavit to INEC. So it's a sworn statement. So basically, the candidate basically pinky swears that I promise everything I've submitted is true. And then it's now up to anyone who wants to take that candidate to court to say that, hey, this guy lied under oath. So this guy committed perjury, because perjury is a very serious criminal offense, right? So basically, even if you show INEC that, look, this thing that this candidate submitted is false, it's not true, INEC by law does not have the power to bar that candidate from running for office or to disqualify that candidate. Only the courts has the power to disqualify a candidate either from running for office or from occupying office. INEC doesn't have that power, which I think is a very obvious sort of, it makes INEC almost powerless.
It seems that way because anyone can literally come and run for the office of the president of Nigeria.
Yeah, so basically, as far as I know, the only thing that can stop you from running for the office of president is if either you've not attained the minimum age, which I think is 40, or you have been convicted of a crime in Nigeria. Sorry, I don't think convicted of a crime. If you have done a prison sentence for a crime in Nigeria, I think that's when. So either that or when you've not reached the age, the minimum age, I think that's the only thing that can bar you from running for president in Nigeria. So,
Wow.
oh, actually, I think there's a third scenario. If you're a dual citizen who obtained dual citizenship through naturalization in another country, supposedly you're not allowed to run for, because you've sworn allegiance to another country, so you're supposedly not allowed to run for president in Nigeria. However, again, these are all sort of more suggestions than facts, because again, if you examine the Tinubu story, it becomes clear that at some point he actually did obtain citizenship in another country. But again, despite this being information that is available to INEC, INEC doesn't have the power to do anything about it. And then secondly, even if someone hasn't committed a criminal offense or gone to jail for it in Nigeria, are you then telling me that if someone has gone to jail abroad, that they can come back to Nigeria and then run for office? Apparently they can. Apparently they can. And apparently it has happened.
Who writes these laws, really? Like, who goes through
that is the question. That is the question. That is the question, because typically, how laws are passed in Nigeria is that they have to pass through the House of Representatives. So passes the first reading, the second reading, and the third reading. Then it goes to the Senate, then it goes to the president for presidential approval when it's signed into law, and then it's gazetted and it becomes law. So it's like a 5-step process. So what that is supposed to do is that at every step of the way, the public has an opportunity to observe and critique this law. In practice, what happens, and I know this because I've worked on several such instances myself, back when I used to write legislative reviews of laws that were being passed, the House will do something called an accelerated hearing. So they'll do a first and second reading, maybe in the space of 24 hours. And you won't hear, and then the actual document, the law itself, the document isn't released anywhere publicly. So you just see an announcement that so-and-so bill passes second reading in the House. And then it's when it's time for the third reading, which is the final reading in the House. And bear in mind, once any law leaves the House, it's almost impossible for you to recall it. So it's when it gets to that third reading that they will now, maybe the night before, they will now release the document to, not even to the media in general, but to specific friends of theirs in the media who may or may not then decide to cover the thing favorably. So I'll give you an example. In 2020, there was a piece of legislation called the NCDC Act. That's the National Center for Disease Control Act. Now, what the NCDC Act claimed, what it was presented as, was an act for the regulation of the control of infectious diseases in Nigeria in response to COVID-19. In practice, what this bill actually was basically a bill to end human rights in Nigeria, because it was a bill that basically gave the Minister of Health all kinds of powers to do all sorts of things. So he gave the Minister of Health power to declare any building in Nigeria based on his own, he doesn't need any scientific input on this, based on his own sole declaration that this building is an infectious diseases hotspot and should be basically confiscated, should be expropriated. It gave the Minister of Health that power. It gave the Minister of Health power to stop people from meeting under the guise of stopping the spread of infectious diseases. In other words, one of the main constitutional rights that most people have anywhere on the planet, which is freedom of assembly, this act was going to take it away from them under the guise of fighting infectious diseases. And this act passed through first reading, second reading. It was the night before the third reading. Then I had a friend who worked for, I think, Channels TV, who was kind of friendly with one of the legislators, who got like a scanned PDF, not even like a proper PDF, just like someone took pictures of every page and then turned it into PDF. And then she sent it across to me. And I literally sat down with my laptop that night. Like, I read through the legislation that night. I did my analysis. I wrote my analysis that night. And I was able to find out that this legislation was basically plagiarized from a Singaporean bill from 1973. Right? And I did all of that in one night, and I published it the next morning. And because of that story that I published the next morning, that's what stopped that bill from getting passed. So in fact, the following year, I actually won a prize for that, the People Journalism Prize for Africa 2020. So, but the point I was making was, this bill passed through first reading, second reading. It was the night before it was supposed to pass through the third reading that I got hold of it, only because a friend of mine happened to be friendly with someone in the House. If not, that bill would have passed third reading and would have gone to the Senate. The president would have signed it into law. And then essentially you would have had, you know, a health minister, and by extension, a president who can override the constitution. You know, so that's how laws are passed in Nigeria. This very opaque manner. One of the campaigns I've been trying to lead for years now is that there should be a central National Assembly database where anybody should be able to log in to see what bills are being considered today. So what bills are being read on the floor of the House? We should know. Why shouldn't we know? It's a democracy. But Nigeria is and if you spend more time speaking to people about Nigeria, you find out that it's what I call an electoral dictatorship. It's not run along democratic principles at all. We hold elections, supposedly, but the country itself isn't run democratically. We don't have access to things we should have access to. So on paper, for example, we have a Freedom of Information Act. But have you ever tried getting information from a Nigerian government body using the Freedom of Information Act? It's almost impossible. You know, so we hold elections, we call ourselves a democracy, but we're not a democracy, we're an electoral dictatorship. That's why it refers to Nigeria. So that's how come laws like that Electoral Act get passed, which got INEC of all the power to do the things that it's supposed to be able to do. And nobody's able to catch it because the reading of the bills is done in a very secretive manner, so that the public doesn't have access to it, so that people like me don't have access to it.
So we were speaking about what is officially known as the background check for Tinubu, and you're starting to tell us what is actually the truth?
Right. So all the institutions mentioned were sent a subpoena. A subpoena is a legal document which is issued under the authority of a court, which compels the person receiving the document to release all information regarding the subject that is written on the subpoena. So in this case, the subject was Bola Ahmed Tinubu. So subpoenas were sent to Richard Daley College, Chicago State University, Deloitte, Arthur Anderson, where he once claimed to have worked, Mobile Oil, all of these places. And the
By
results,
claiming, is he the one who said he had worked, who has worked with
yeah,
those organizations? So he's the one who
yeah,
said, I have worked with these organizations.
he gave several news interviews where he claimed to have worked
Okay, he
with them.
claimed.
In fact, one of the major claims he made, which made me very determined to find this out, was where he claimed that he made $1.8 million from an engagement at Deloitte. Now, if you've ever worked at a big four accounting firm, I've worked at a big four firm before. I briefly worked at KPMG at the start of my career. So I kind of had an idea already of what, and I have several friends who work at like PwC, KPMG, BCG, Ernst & Young. So I have an idea of what their payment structure looks like in the 21st century. And I know that even a partner does not make anything close to that kind of money. Even a partner, which is the highest rank you can get, doesn't make anything close to $1 million. It's not possible. And then here you are telling me that as basically like like maybe a junior associate, or at best an associate, in like less than 5 years into your career as an accountant, someone paid you a bonus of over $1 million. How? Come on. So that's how I was determined that, look, I have to get to the bottom of this. In addition to just proving that this is mathematically impossible, I also have to prove via a subpoena that this guy never actually had any such engagement. So subpoenas were sent to all these institutions, and they all go back to us. So at Chicago State University, it was very interesting what they submitted in particular, because the records that they submitted, that they released to us, showed that the person known as Bola A. Tinubu, the name wasn't Bola Ahmed Tinubu, it was Bola A. Tinubu. The person on their records who was known as Bola A. Tinubu, who was admitted and who graduated in 1979 with a degree in business management, was female. The sex was written there very clearly, F. So this person was female. As far as we know, the person known as Bola Ahmed Tinubu he's not a transgender person, as far as we know. So it's not as if he was once female and transitioned into a man. You know, he was born a man, he has always been a man. So what is going on here? And then the degree certificate which he submitted to INEC, which obviously, because it's on public record, we had access to it, versus the degree certificate which the what's it called, Chicago State University sent to us, which was a direct reprint of the degree certificate that was issued to Bola A. Tinubu. They are two completely different documents. The signatures on the documents are different. The placements of several elements on the documents are different. The dates on the documents are different. The logo of the university on the documents are different. The wording of the degree awarding sentence on the documents are different. And then the one he submitted to INEC had 2 grammatical errors on it. And then what took it to even more like unbelievable levels was literally, if you Google, and you can try this as you are right now, if you Google fake Chicago State University certificates, one of the very first search results that will pop up, the images that you see, is a template, right? Which comes from a website called diploma-makers.com. So that's diplomamakers.com. And when you go to that website and you check through the repository, you will see a template for a fake Chicago State University that matches exactly what Bola Tinubu submitted to INEC. So basically, he or someone working for him was so lazy that they couldn't even be bothered to forge a proper Chicago State University certificate properly. They went to an online fake diploma service called diplomamakers.com and basically bought a fake university degree from there for Chicago State University. And you can tell it's the same document because the template uses this. It has the same grammatical errors on it, has the same placement. It's the same document, but it's just the name on it is different. So basically what that means is that the person who graduated from Chicago State University, that Bola A. Tinubu, and the person we know today as Bola Ahmed Tinubu, are not in fact the same person. So basically this guy has potentially committed some form of identity theft at some point, right? And then now this person apparently was able to come back to Nigeria in the early 90s and run for office. He became a senator because I guess back then there was no internet, there was no way of verifying any of these things. And he has been able to escape all this scrutiny for all these years until now when he ran for president. And unfortunately, or fortunately, people like me are around and the internet is around. And all of a sudden, this kind of fact checking can be done.
Did they think that nobody's gonna check on the certificate or?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like it's clear that they've got away with it for so long. And bear
Okay,
in mind that this isn't even the first time that an issue like this has come up. Because as I recall, in 1999, shortly after he became governor, he initially claimed on his INEC form in 1999 that he attended the University of Chicago. Before then, later on, he said, no, it was a mistake, that it's actually Chicago State University. So he has always had all these question marks around his history. But I think, again, because there was no internet back then, that's the most important thing. So basically, information was very tightly controlled. The person that had money could control what was printed in the newspapers, what was said on the radio and on TV. So it was able to get away from these questions. It was possible to get away from these questions for years, for decades. But I think the biggest mistake he made was running for president. Because, you know, he had left office since 2007. So I guess nobody had any real reason to investigate him after 2007 when internet access started becoming a thing. So he has been out of office for all this while. He has been a godfather operating in the shadows. So no one has ever really had any real reason to look into him until now. Now he said you're running for president. Okay, we need to know who the person that says he wants to be our president actually is. And then all these things emerge that actually this person is not at all who he claims to be. Right. And this information isn't even that difficult to find, but it's just that because he's banking on the fact that he has got away with it for so long and people already know him. So no one is going to really believe at this point that someone that we've known for all these years could have been lying about absolutely everything.
I mean, and in a way, it really shows how broken the system is because he got away with it for so long, such that he's even confident that he can run for the office of the president.
And he did run. He did run, and he was declared winner. I mean, he didn't win the election, but he was declared winner. So as it stands, except there's a successful legal challenge, as it stands, on May 29, he's actually going to be sworn in as Nigeria's president.
How does the future look like? Do you think he's gonna be sworn in?
That's a very difficult question, to be honest. I honestly have no idea, because I know for a fact that so in Nigeria, for your position as a president to be tenable, to be properly feasible, in addition to political political credibility, you also need to command a certain amount of respect within the armed forces, the military, right? The military is still a very big player in the political space in Nigeria, make no mistake about it. And you also need to have international credibility. He has none of those three things. He's not politically credible because he didn't win the election. Like, so officially it's claimed that he got 8 million votes. The data that is available shows that he got nothing close to that, but officially it's claimed he got 8 million votes. There were 89 million registered voters in this election campaign. So someone with less than 10% of the total possible votes cannot possibly have legitimacy, political legitimacy. In the armed forces, he commands zero respect, because apart from the fact that his history as a drug pusher is now out in the open, it has also been known that he has absolutely zero credibility and zero pedigree within the armed forces. If I'm not mistaken, he's the second president since 1999 to have absolutely zero military background. The first was Goodluck Jonathan, who was a one-term president. He's going to be the second if he's sworn in. So there's that. And then finally, the international issue with international credibility. His indictment for drug trafficking took place in the US. To date, as we speak, yeah, while other heads of states have acknowledged him as the president-elect, Joe Biden's administration has not acknowledged him. That's a very significant thing. It doesn't mean that they won't, but usually the day after or 2 days after, they always sort of send a congratulatory message to whoever wins, whoever is declared winner of Nigerian election. This time around, it was declared winner, well, it's coming up to 3 weeks now, and the US government has said absolutely nothing. So that's a very interesting situation. So I have no idea whether he's actually going to make it to May 29 because I've heard all sorts of things. I've heard, I have sources in the security
Just
service.
excuse me, just a second. There seemed to be a glitch on your video.
I'm seeing it too. I don't understand why. I don't understand where it's coming from.
I saw. Okay, now I
Okay,
think that stopped. Okay,
right,
cool.
okay.
Yeah. So you're
So,
saying you had
so I'm
gotten
saying,
information?
yeah, I'm saying so. There are sources in the security services who say that even they have no idea what is going to happen between now and May 29. There are sources in the media and in government and civil society circles who insist that there are all sorts of like high level, like global consultations. I don't know how true any of that is. But what I do know is that even he himself um, is feeling pressured to try and drum up some sort of legitimacy for himself because he knows that he knows he did not win the mandate. First of all, he knows he did not win the votes, but he wants to be president. So I don't know if you saw this a couple of days ago. A prominent member of his campaign team was on Twitter tweeting at Joe Biden and telling him Joe pick up the phone to congratulate him, basically that they please acknowledge him as winner of the election. So even he, sorry,
please proceed.
So I said so it's clear that even he knows that he is lacking credibility both locally and internationally. Locally, he might be able to get around that by using force, which is what African leaders tend to do. But internationally, it's going to be a completely different ballgame. Because bear in mind that basically Nigeria is at its most indebted level that it has been in, definitely in my lifetime. Nigeria is owing something like 80 billion, or is it something billion US dollars? Its foreign loan, its foreign credits burden is higher than it has ever been at any point in my lifetime. So, and I was born in 1990. So basically, anyone who pisses off the international community at this point in time and potentially risks sanctions could basically destroy the entire Nigerian economy. So he understands that he needs the buy-in, particularly of the US government, because the bulk of Nigeria's foreign creditors are American. The bulk of Nigeria's dollar-denominated debt comes from American creditors. So if he does anything, or if there's anything that could lead to the imposition of US sanctions, that would be the end of his dream of being president, and he knows that. So in all probability, is he going to be sworn in on May 29? Well, the truth is, I haven't seen anything to say categorically that he's not. However, I've always maintained, because in addition to knowing him as a politician from a distance, I also happen to know him in person because my dad once worked with him for a while. I know for a fact that this guy does not have what it takes to manage the kind of crisis he's going to be walking into if he becomes president of Nigeria, because the way he has been able to do it in Lagos, where everything is transactional, everything is just about paying off this person or that person, or using thugs to intimidate this person or that person. You cannot do that on a national level. There's 180 million people that you're going to govern, right? So if you can do your little intimidation tactics in Lagos and pay a few people off here and there, how are you going to do that at national level? He doesn't have that capacity. I know that for a fact. So I think it's going to be very interesting if he is sworn in, and I think he might be, because I don't see anything necessarily stopping that from happening. But if he's sworn in, I think that's where his problems will just be starting. If he's actually sworn in, I think it's very interesting to just watch what will play out, because it's not going to be fun at all, especially not for him.
he seems very confident that he's going to be sworn in. And with that confidence, you'd expect that, he'll probably have a country like the US backing him up, but that doesn't seem to be the case. What gives him the power to be sure that he's going to be the next president of Nigeria? What gives him the confidence?
I think so. If you know him in person, where I do, you will understand that this is someone whose entire persona is built on everything being transactional. So he believes that he has spent 20 plus years building relationships in the right places, putting money in the right hands, creating favorable situations in the right places, currying favors with the right people, and that now everything has come together and it's his time for everyone to pay him back. If you recall, his campaign tagline was Emilio Con, which literally translates as "It's my turn." That wasn't sarcastic. It's what he genuinely meant it. It's my turn. I have done XYZ for all of you, be it, people that he has had political relationships with, be it business people, be it trade unions. His entire thing is built on, look, I have an inexhaustible pile of money somewhere and I can give you what you want if you give me what I want. He's a very transactional person. So as far as he's concerned, Nigeria is just a microcosm of what he has done in Lagos. So he has been able to buy his way into everything in Lagos. Even the name that he uses, as I mentioned earlier, he committed identity theft. He's not a member of the Tinubu family. Tinubu family is a very well-known old family that traces its roots back hundreds of years, back to the colonial era in Lagos. He's not a member of the family. He's not in the family register, but he has been able to buy his way in. Even an old revered family like that, because of money, has been able to look the other way because that's how things are done in that part of the country. So he believes that I've been able to buy everything that I've ever wanted up until this point in time. Why would that fail me now? Why wouldn't I be able to get whatever I want? So I've done all this work for the past 20, 30 years, and now it's my time to reap. Now it's my time to enjoy the fruits of all these strategic political favors that I've been putting in the right places. So he has, to his credit, you have to say, he has done a bang-up job of cultivating friendships and relationships everywhere. He has cultivated friendships in the media, in government circles, in the civil service, obviously political partnership alliances that we know very well, alliances in diplomatic spaces, in civil society, everywhere you can think of. He has put money everywhere. So he has a whole bunch of people from places that you wouldn't even imagine who are indebted to him in some way or the other. So you can understand why he has that sort of exaggerated swagger about it, because as far as he's concerned, who's going to stop me? Everybody who matters has been bought as far as he's concerned. So, but what I also believe is that regardless, if he is sworn in, he's going to realize very quickly that using money to buy your way into political power is not the same thing as being able to govern. Because the way you can use money to buy your way into being declared the winner of an election, for example, you cannot use money the same way to make people love you. You can't do that. There is enough money in the whole of the Nigerian government federation account to bribe every single Nigerian. You can't do that. So that transactional system of leadership that you've been used to, where you use bribery in conjunction with violence, basically, that can't work on a national level. Because if you try to use violence on a national level, if you try to use the military and the way you use your little network of thugs and whatnot in Lagos, if you try to use the military that way, they're going to conduct a coup. They're going to kick you out because the military is a very proud institution. So you can't do that. You're going to have to learn how to level with people and make them see your point of view instead of just paying them off or threatening them. And he has never developed that skill set before. All he has done in his political career is pay people off or threaten them or carry out his threats. That's all he has ever done. So yes, he might have a very good chance of being sworn in, but as I said earlier, when he's sworn in, that's when his problems have just started. So stay tuned.
With the investigative pieces that you have written on him, do you think they might make a difference between today and May before he's sworn in?
So that will depend on if you recall what I said about INEC not having the power to disqualify candidates proactively or retroactively, only the court has that power. The proviso to that is one of the candidates who either ran against him in the primary elections, the party primaries, or one of the candidates who ran against him at the actual elections has to actually institute that legal case against him for the court to hear it. So far, there hasn't been any indication that any of the main challengers, whether from within his party or from the other parties, are going to go to court with it. There's always Nigeria being Nigeria, there's always a possibility that one of them is sort of holding it in reserve to use as like a last minute Hail Mary trump card. But I mean, so far there hasn't really been anything. So far, this information is out there. The lawyer did file a criminal complaint in November. This complaint hasn't been picked up by any judge. All the judges are running away from it because no judge wants to touch it. Basically, all the judges are scared because it's such an explosive case, right? So the only thing that can change that is if one of the major candidates comes out and actually owns that case and says, I want to institute this criminal complaint. And then a major judge will have no choice but to take it because someone has actually come out to sort of put their name and face to it that I am so and so candidate and I am taking this guy to court. The reason all the judges are running away from it is that the judges don't want to be seen as partisan. They don't want to be seen as the judge that is trying to go after Tinubu.
Are they doing that because they're afraid that he might become the president and they're afraid what might happen after that?
Yes, absolutely.
So it sounds like chances of anyone really, making a change in the results is pretty much slim to none.
I wouldn't say none, but it is slim. Yes, going by precedent, it is slim. Yes.
Where is Peter Obi? Because most of the Nigerian youth I speak to and I interact with, they seem to be rooting for Peter Obi, right? Because they believe that he's probably
and they did vote for him in their numbers.
So they believe that Peter Obi should be their next president.
And I believe so too, because I've actually seen the data. So the result sheets, the hundreds of thousands of result sheets, which were not sent, even though they were supposed to be sent, and which we eventually got access to, it indicates very clearly that Peter Obi didn't just win the election. He actually won it in a landslide. However, the problem I don't want to say the problem, but the key difference between Peter Obi and Bola Tinubu is that Peter Obi is not a career politician. Peter Obi is a billionaire businessman who happens to go into politics. Had it been the roles were reversed, and it was Tinubu who was in a situation where he won an electoral landslide and then his mandate was stolen by the other candidates, what Tinubu would have done is something like what's that Kenyan candidate who lost the election? What's his name?
Raila Odinga.
Raila Odinga. Thank you very much. Yes. So what Raila Odinga did in I believe it was 2015, was it 2016? No, it was 2015, where he was declared the what's his name? Uhuru Kenyatta was declared the winner of the election. Then Raila Odinga took his supporters to some stadium or whatever and got some judge to do like a mock swearing in and called himself the people's president. That kind of stunt, even though you could say it's treasonous, that's exactly the sort of thing Tinubu would have done if he was in Peter Obi's position. Because that's what a politician would do. If you know that the people are on your side, or you have a large enough number of people on your side, then you know that there are other cards you can play in addition to just going to court, because you know that the security agencies, for example, are not going to come after you, because if they know that if they do, they can start a civil war. So you play that to your advantage. That's what an African politician would do. Well, Peter Obi as I said, is a businessman, he's not a politician. So because I've actually spoken to him since the announcement, and all he's concerned about is, well, gather evidence, go to courts. gather evidence, put our legal case together properly, blah, blah, blah. But the thing, I personally, I haven't told him this. I'm not part of his campaign team anyway. But what I personally believe is when you're working in an African context, in addition to following the letter of the law, you always have to have a certain element of, you know what, I have the carrot, but I also have a stick. So if I'm doing things the right way and you are determined to frustrate me, even though I'm trying to do things the right way, I have another thing in reserve and I'm going to make sure that you can see it. I might not use it, but I'm going to make sure you can see it and see that they have the capacity to use it. And that might make you think twice about trying to frustrate me. I personally believe that Peter Obi should, ever since the supposed results were announced, he should have come out publicly and led maybe a couple of rallies or something, just a show of force. Not a protest, not a riot, nothing like that, but just a rally, just a show of force, just so the authorities understand that this thing isn't going to be as easy as you think it is. It's not a matter of you just declare anyone you like to be the winner and then the person gets sworn in and that's the end of that. The youth are still here. They're still on the streets. They've not gone anywhere. And you're going to have to answer that question to them. That's what I think he should have done. But ultimately, obviously, I mean, he's the one running for president, not me. And I can only speak as an outsider. I mean, if I knew as much about politics as he does, probably I'll be the one who would have been running for president, not him. So, but we have to wait and see.
We have to wait and see. Should the results stand, what should you expect out of Tinubu's administration?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And the reason I say nothing is using his managerial capacity as evidenced by his tenure in Lagos as the case in point, the only thing to expect is that he's going to bring in his friends and cronies to basically eat their own share. That's what it's all about, to be honest. I lived in Lagos between 1999 and 2007 when he was governor. I was born and raised in Lagos. I'm actually from Lagos. Lagos is my hometown. And even as a 9-year-old to a 17-year-old, as I was at the time, it was very clear, even at that young age, that even though the Nigerian economy was growing in leaps and bounds at the time, Lagos wasn't moving in any appreciable direction. And when I say Lagos was, I mean in the most basic, banal ways. The way African politicians claim that they're doing good things because they built roads or they built houses, they built schools.
Oh,
Even
because
though those things, even
when
though
they
those
do what
things
they're supposed to do.
exactly. Even though those things are not any kind of a big deal, is what you're paid to do. But even those things he didn't do. Lagos was an
What was he
absolute
doing in the
mess.
office?
What he was doing was building political alliances, securing using state funds to secure his political future, and to basically build the political machine that would someday become the APC, which is in power now. So it's important to give some background to this. At the time, the government, the federal government, which was in power in Abuja, was led by a party called the PDP, right? At the time, Tinubu belonged to a relatively small political formation called the Alliance for Democracy, the AD. It was a relatively small party. And as at 2003, the AD controlled only one state in the whole of Nigeria, out of 36 states, just Lagos, where he was the governor. So it was a very relatively small party. There wasn't really anything going for it. So all that he wanted to do was secure his own long-term political future by building alliances and expanding the AD into something bigger that could someday challenge the PDP. So in 2007, the AD became something called the Action Congress. They changed the name, they changed the symbol, they took in a few other, like they merged a few parties, a few formations, became the Action Congress. Then by 2010, it had become the Action Congress of Nigeria, the ACN. So that the 2011 election was where the ACN made its first significant attempt to try to dislodge the PDP. It was unsuccessful. But then by 2015, after the ACN then went into a merger with a northern political party called the CPC, and then together they became a party known as the APC. That coalition was what then dislodged the PDP in 2015. and they are now the federal government, right? So between 1999 and 2007, all Tinubu was interested in was building up his little party called the AD into that political juggernaut that could someday challenge the central government, because he has always had that ambition of being president. But it's just that obviously he couldn't run for president on the platform of the AD. It was too small. He needed a very big party like the APC behind him. But to get that kind of party, he needed to build that political formation. He needed to build those partnerships that only the PDP had at that time, right? And it's also important to remember that the PDP, because it was a party that was directly born out of military dictatorship, most of its founding members were ex-military generals. So it was also a very arrogant party, and it was a party that believed that it was going to remain in power forever. So in fact, there was a time when Tinubu had positioned himself as the good guy, the opposition guy. He was the Raila Odinga of Nigeria at a time. There was a time like that where he was perceived as the guy who was fighting this big bad federal government in the center, and they would never let him win, but he was fighting for the small guy. There was a time he was perceived as that person. Obviously, he had his own agenda, all along, but he was successful at what he did, and look at him today.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can only wait and see how this unfolds.
Yep.
One of the topics that you had also written intensively on is jihadists' existence in Nigeria. Who are jihadists? And what are they doing in Nigeria?
So if you heard of a group called Boko Haram, which at the time was the world's deadliest terror organization, I think those are the most visible jihadi organization. That's the most visible jihadi organization in Nigeria. There's several. There's the Islamic State West Africa Province, ISWAP. There's the Ansaru, as they call them. These are all splinter factions of essentially the same thing, which is Salafi terror movements committed to spreading a sort of extremist Sunni interpretation of Islam using force. So there are sort of two, I wouldn't call them two conflicting schools of thought, but there are two separate schools of thought. They're not necessarily conflicting, but separate schools of thought within this sort of extremist Sunni Islamic movement. So there's the Al-Qaeda faction, which is more of like a political jihad. So they believe that instead of just going out and shooting bullets and detonating bombs, that political education of Muslims is the most important strategy. It's the most important part of the strategy toward achieving a global Islamic theocracy. So basically that Muslims need to be sufficiently radicalized to understand the necessity of jihad, and that's the first thing. That's the first step. Meanwhile, there's the sort of ISIS Boko Haram faction, which believes that violence now, right now, is imperative. It's what they need to do now. So the reason I said they are not conflicting is that ultimately the goals converge in the same place, and the goals also converge in violence. But it's just that the starting points are different. So the starting point of one is extremist brainwashing, and the starting point of the other is violence right from the start. So they both come from the same source. Now, if you read that story that I published, Conflicts for Jihad, the Boko Haram origin story, in October 2021, I also published a documentary based on that story. It's also on the YouTube channel for West Africa Weekly. If you read that story, watch that documentary, it basically outlines where this came from in the Nigerian context, because it's always been a subject of controversy where exactly did Boko Haram come from. Because to many Nigerians, especially to Nigerians who grew up in the north, where there's a predominantly Muslim population, they don't understand how this form of Islam came to be, because the north that they remember growing up in was a very peaceful place. My dad spent a lot of his youth in the northern part of Nigeria, in a place called Sokoto. I mean, you couldn't set foot in Sokoto right now because it's that unsafe. But my dad, at a point, actually considered settling down there, like permanently. He actually considered it at a point. after his national youth service, because that's how comfortable he felt there in the 70s. So to many people, there was that question of when did this shift happen? Where did this come from? That one day we were perfectly fine, we were living in peace with these people, and then the next day we started hearing about suicide bombers and things that were completely foreign to us. In fact, I remember as recently as 2009, when we heard of the first ever Nigerian suicide bomber, a guy called Abdul Muttalab, who tried to bomb a transatlantic plane that was flying from a KLM flight from Amsterdam to, I think, JFK Airport, and he got caught. He was the so-called underpants bomber. So when we first heard about that in 2009, it was almost like a topic of comedy in Nigerian popular culture. That whoever heard of such a thing as a Nigerian suicide bomber, ha 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 ha. It was hilarious at the time. And then a couple of years later, it wasn't funny anymore because it became a weekly occurrence in Nigeria. So what that story did was to trace the origin of this thing. This is where it came from. This is who funded it. These were the key characters involved. These were the collaborators in business. These are the collaborators in government. These were the collaborators who had links to the military. And this is how we got from where we were in the 60s to where we are today in the 2020s.
And what has the Nigerian government been doing with regards to that?
As usual, absolutely nothing. As usual. I mean, in this case, it shouldn't be that much of a surprise, because if you read that article, there's actually a picture in that article of the current president, Muhammadu Buhari, appearing in a picture with one of the people who mentioned in the story, who was arrested by the Nigerian secret police for setting up terror cells in Kano and Katsina in 2002. And in 2018, he had a picture of the Nigerian president posing with this guy inside Aso Rock itself, inside the Nigerian State House, the Federal State House. So I guess it's not a surprise, because it's a case of show me your friends and I'll tell you who you are.
How did you get into this? Becoming an investigative journalist and becoming a writer and just doing the work that you're doing.
So I actually started off as a writer. That's all I ever wanted to do. That's all I ever wanted to be. The first time I ever got any kind of recognition for something that I wrote was in 2006. There used to be a global essay competition called the Royal Commonwealth Society's Right Around the World Essay Competition. And I was 16 at the time in sixth form college in Lagos. And I put in an entry and I came third worldwide in this thing. At the time, I was studying, like, because in a Nigerian family, you're supposed to study something like STEM or like commercial, a serious course. So it's physics, it's chemistry, biology, it's math. That's what you're supposed to do at that age. So that's the combination I was doing at the time, and I was very unhappy because I was more of a social science person. But obviously, my family didn't know what the hell that was. So when I was preparing to go off to university, I was going to university in the UK. I filled in my UCAS form and I filled in business management. And I went to meet my favorite teacher, a guy called Mr. Kule. He was my English teacher. And I asked him for a reference, to write a reference for me. And he said, why would you study business management? That you're a good writer and you write a lot. Why don't you just do what you're good at? And that one of those moments where somebody just changed your life, but they don't realize it. Because that single sentence that he made is the reason why I'm having this conversation with you today. That was in 2006, when he made that comment. So I went back and I changed my program. Instead of business management, I decided that I wanted to do journalism, because I figured, look, how else am I going to make a living out of writing? It has to be journalism. And obviously my parents did not understand it. My parents were like, hell no. We're like, how on earth are we going to spend like 12, 15,000 pounds annually to send you abroad to go study journalism? Why would you want to do journalism? And bear in mind that I was like the family's black sheep. So my sister was an engineer, my brother was a doctor, my older sister was a banker, my younger sister would later become a stockbroker. And then there I was saying that I wanted to be a writer. Like, what the hell does that even mean? So that conversation didn't go well. because of that, I ended up getting held back a year. So instead of starting university in 2007, I started in 2008. So I started at the University of Hull in 2008. I studied creative writing and media, culture, and society, very much to my parents' displeasure. But they felt like, you know what, this guy, he's a lost cause. Let's just give him what he wants, whatever. Like they had given up. I was and am the family's black sheep. Like, let's be very clear about that. I was and I still am, because they didn't understand what I was doing at the time, and they still don't understand it. Like, why on earth, of all the things you could use this brain to do in this life, why on earth would it be this thing? So after I finished, the plan was initially to get a job at the BBC, then marry my girlfriend, have a kid, get a dog, like live happily ever after. Obviously, that didn't happen. So I came back to Nigeria in 2013 and I basically started afresh, like from scratch, because like my career in the UK didn't take off the way I hoped for it to. It just didn't happen for me. So after my youth service, I started off at a newspaper called Vanguard newspaper. And I didn't spend up to a month there. And then the editor actually told me that, look, I've seen the quality of what you write, and we know that within 6 months you're going to leave. And we don't like having too much employee turnover. So what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to help you, I'm going to hook you up with a place where you're going to be better paid. He thought he was doing me a favor. I mean, he was doing me a favor because it was a financial favor. So he hooked me up with a friend of his who ran a PR agency. So which is how come I ended up starting my substantive career in PR, right? So most people typically move from journalism into communications and PR. I moved from communications and PR back into journalism. So I started off in communications and PR at the company called BHM. I was there for just under 2 years. By the time I left, I was head of content, and I left to set up my own content creation, my own copywriting agency, which didn't really take off. And then after like nearly a year of floundering about, I got the opportunity to join Channels TV. So there was a political satire show called The Other News. If you've ever watched The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, The Other News is like a Nigerian version of that. In fact, we directly based The Other News on the format of The Daily Show, but it was strictly Nigerian content. And it was quite successful. At our peak, we had over 1.5 million weekly viewers. It was quite a successful show. I was the first writer actually on the show, and actually hired out the rest of the writing team, which I'm still proud of. The show, like as a result of my involvement on that show, like other doors started to open. I was featured in a New Yorker magazine. I was invited to take part in the US International Visitors Leadership Program. I was featured in a Netflix documentary. You know, a couple of doors here and there began to open. And then I started freelancing for like foreign publications like Yahoo Finance, those sorts of things. I was just basically doing like short news and opinion pieces for them. The money was good, but that's what I was doing for a while. And then I had like 5 or 6 of them that I was doing that kind of work for. So I was doing maybe like I was living in Lagos at the time, and I was doing like $3,000 to $4,000 a month, which to me that was big money. And I was living my best life at the time. That was like 2017 going into early 2019. And then I got the opportunity to start doing some work in Nigeria, because bear in mind that nobody in Nigeria knew who I was at this point in time. I think I had like 700 followers on Twitter or something. Like I was a total nobody in Nigeria. I was known in the international space, but nobody in Nigeria knew who the hell I was. And then I got the opportunity in April 2019 to start doing some work in Nigeria. A daily newspaper in Nigeria called Business Day reached out to me, and they said they've been following my work, and they want that like their readership is kind of aging a bit, and they're trying to attract a younger demographic to like refresh because basically if your readership is aging out, then that means your publication is dying. And that means your advert revenue is going to start drying up or whatnot. So they're trying to lower the average age of their readership, and they're trying to do that by getting more youthful voices to write in the paper. So I started doing an opinion column for them, which was once a week. And it became very successful. It became the most read column in the newspaper. And that opened even more doors. I did some work for CNN Africa, then just little doors here and there. But none of this was investigative work. This was just like analysis and opinion stuff. And then in August 2019, I did my first ever investigative story. I have a cousin who was working he had just left his job he's a doctor. He had just left his job at a hospital in a town called Badagry in Lagos. And he had this like really awful story about how the hospital was like under-equipped, the taps weren't running. Sometimes doctors carried out operations using their phone flashlights because the diesel for the generators wasn't supplied, so there was no electricity. Just really horrible stuff. And he put me in contact with a couple of doctors and nurses there, and I spoke to them. So I did what I didn't think of it as an investigative story. I just thought of it as a story, like a human interest story. But I guess it was technically my first ever investigative journalism, my first ever attempt at investigative journalism. And it had some kind of an impact because prior to the story, the maternal mortality rate for deliveries done using C-section was 4 in 10. After the story, then the Lagos State Health Service Commission came and started doing inspections. They fired a few people, and that figure came down to about 2 in 10, which is still too much, but actual lives were saved. And after that, then the light bulb went off above my head that, wow, something I did save somebody's life. I want to do more of this. So a lady called Mercy Abang, who runs a platform called newswire.com, she then reached out in September, which was the following month. And she had this story that she had already done the groundwork on the story. She had already done the actual investigation. She just wanted me to write it because she liked the way I wrote. So I read what she had, but I thought I could do more with it. So I asked her for all the material that she had, the victim she had spoken to, because it was a story about this thing called the Abuja raids, where young women were getting kidnapped off the streets of Abuja on suspicion of being prostitutes. Right, because prostitution was an illegal gray area. So basically, depending on who was the FCT minister, it could be designated as legal or illegal, depending on what side of the bed they woke up on. So she brought this story to my attention, and I ended up writing it in my own voice. I think that was the first time I ever did a David Hundeyin investigative story, like using the voice that you're kind of familiar with now. And it went super viral, first of all. Everybody read it, and then it apparently had so much of an impact that the following month, one of the ladies who was named in the reports, because she had taken the FCT minister to court over what happened to her, she won her case, and in the ruling, which was delivered in the FCT High Court by Justice Binta Nyako, my story was actually mentioned in the ruling. So again, that's like, from the moment that happened, it just felt like, okay, you people don't know what you've just done. Like, you people are not ready for me now, because this is all I'm going to do from now on. So that was like late 2019. So it was like January 2020 that I then decided, okay, this is what I am doing. I'm going to cut down on the amount of freelancing that I do for all these other publications, because they take up a lot of my time. And I'm going to start focusing on this. The money wasn't, I was getting paid 20,000 naira for a story. And I was doing 5 stories a month. That's 100,000 naira a month. That's about, in today's currency, in dollars, that's about $120 a month. Like, it was nothing. But for me, it wasn't about money. It was about the fact that, oh my God, I'm finally getting to do this thing I've always wanted to do. So I did that up until November 2020, when I eventually punched my ticket and I had to flee the country, because the story that I was doing was finally going to get me arrested. I'd been threatened with arrest once, but I hadn't been arrested before. And funny story, the person who threatened me was a family member, but he's a member of the security services. He actually threatened me at a family event with a smile on his face. Threatened me, he touched my glasses, and he was like, have you been to the SSS headquarters in Abuja? The SSS is the State Security Services, Nigerian Secret Police. So have you been to the SSS headquarters in Abuja? That it goes 7 stories on the ground. And that if you're in one of those underground cells, you won't see anything with your glasses. And then he walked off. So, yeah, that's kind of like a very short and abridged story of how I moved from A to B.
What made you an exceptional writer?
I think because during my childhood, I wasn't really allowed to have much of a childhood. My parents were Jehovah's Witnesses. So, and if you know anything or two about Jehovah's Witnesses, they it's a religious cult, for lack of a better term. And you are not allowed, as much as possible, you're not supposed to associate with anyone who is not from within the religious cult. So I wasn't really allowed to have like friends. Like my friends at school, I actually had to hide the fact that I had friends at school from my parents. And they weren't allowed to like visit me at home. I wasn't allowed to visit them. I wasn't allowed to like have video games. We weren't even allowed to have DSTV until I was like 15 or something. You understand? So the only escape that I had at home was books and reading material. And we had a ton. That's the one good thing I have to say about my parents. Like, there was a surplus of reading material. We had the family library, I'm not exaggerating, had nothing less than 1,000 books inside it. And then in addition to the books, that used every week or every month, he used to, every edition of Newsweek, Reader's Digest, Time magazine, BBC Focus on Africa, back when it used to be a print magazine, Tell magazine, you wouldn't know it's a Nigerian magazine, and then all the daily newspapers. So there was just, my head is just constantly there was nothing else to do. There was no TV to watch. There were no video games to play. There were no friends to play with. And I was a middle child. So the three oldest kids had like their own little clique. And then my younger sister, who was 4 years younger, was like the last born. She was with my mom. So I was just by myself all the time. So literally all I had was just books, reading material, and my imagination. And I think the more you read, the better you write. It's just that simple. The more you take in, the more you'll be able to put out. Because especially when you're reading stuff by authors like Terry Pratchett, really witty stuff, you pick up things subconsciously, and then later on when you are writing, you find yourself doing things that they did. So it's almost like you're copying them, but you're copying from you're borrowing from different people, and then you're turning it into your own voice, into your own style. And that's how, before you know it, when you do that for a few years, you build your own unique voice and style, and then you become recognized as a good writer. So even though I certainly don't recommend having a Jehovah's Witness childhood for anyone, it wasn't fun, but I have to credit it. I probably wouldn't have a career without it.
You wouldn't probably have had a career without it.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm really glad on the work that you're doing, and I'm glad that your teacher gave you an advice that changed your life forever, because I think in a way that it's already impacting a lot of people, it's already impacting a lot of lives, and at the same time you're really willing to risk your life for this. So really appreciate the work you're doing. I really admire what you've been working on, the work you've been doing, and trying to show us what really exists behind the curtain, because the mainstream media controls the narrative, really, so we don't get an opportunity to know what's going on. And I think having individuals like yourself is really an inspiring thing, and I hope we can have more young people also inspired by the work that you're doing, and them also want to venture into what you're doing right now. And this has been an amazing conversation. I really loved it, learned a lot, and thank you for making time, and thank you for coming to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, bye-bye.